Albert Camus, who was no Christian, an existentialist philosopher, said the only way to deal with an unfree world is to become so absolutely free that your very existence is an act of rebellion. My friend Steve Brown, who's preached here a couple times, once said that you should live your life with such scandalous freedom that religious people question your salvation. Same sort of thing. This is what Paul is hammering home in this letter. In this letter that he wrote to the Christians in the region of Galatia, this is what he's hammering home. He can't believe the Galatians are so quickly reverting to the idea that keeping the rules makes us right with God. He can't believe it. He had gone there. He had preached the gospel to them, to both Jews and Gentiles. They believed. They couldn't believe what they were hearing, but they believed. God gave them faith to believe. And now these religious teachers had come into town and were teaching them that everything Paul had taught was wrong, and they needed to get back to doing God's will by obeying God's law. And if they didn't, then clearly they didn't belong to God. He can't believe it. In fact, he comes right out in verse 1 and calls them fools. Fools. Now, Psalm 14:1 defines what a fool is. The psalmist says, "The fool declares in his heart, there is no God." So when Paul calls them fools, he's saying something very poignant. By assuming that you can work your way into God's favor, you've become functional atheists. You don't have to be a theoretical atheist in order to be a functional one. In other words, you can believe in God and live as if God doesn't exist. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying by not believing in God's grace, you're not believing in God. To not believe in the grace that you've been given and the God behind that grace, you're believing in a caricature of God. You're believing in some angry schoolmaster on high, but it's not God. And then in verse 3, Paul basically says, where did you get the idea that God's work gets you in, but it's your work that keeps you in? I mean, where did you get that idea, he's saying? And this is the way many Christians today think. It's God on a cross that gets us in, but it's us climbing a ladder that keeps us in. Which is why Martin Luther, my historical hero, famously said, the sin beneath all sins is the lie that we cannot trust the love and grace of God and that we must therefore take matters into our own hands. And then in verses 6 through 9, Paul brings up Abraham, which is a stroke of genius on his part for this reason. Because the religious teachers kept insisting that keeping the law that God gave to Moses is the only way to get God's approval. But Paul goes one up on them by pointing back to Abraham, who preceded Moses by 400 years. The religious teachers looked to Abraham as their head, as their patriarch. He was their founder. And Paul points out that Abraham was not made right with God by keeping the law. The law wasn't even around yet. So clearly Abraham could not have been made right with God by keeping the law. The law came 400 years later. He was made right by believing God, and that the belief he exercised was itself a gift from God. So it's a killer argument that he makes, especially in that context. He's looking at the people who admire, who look up to, who bank everything on their father Abraham. And he says, if you guys want to insist on this idea that in order to be made right with God, you have to keep the law of Moses, but the Bible itself says, the Old Testament itself says, that Abraham was made right with God by believing God. Not by doing things, not by keeping the law, not by keeping the rules, but by believing, by faith.